Hello, Quiara.
Hi, Jade. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. The weather is nice. I'm here discussing books and language and culture with you. I mean, I couldn't get any better. How's your day been?
Um, this is a highlight. I'm blessed at a moment of so much upheaval to get a moment to connect with community right now. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I completely feel that, and I'm deeply honored to have the joy to speak with you today. And I want you to know that when I actually read My Broken Language about a year after I started work with Looking Bilingüe, and the truth is, as Latino, Latinas, Latines, we have specific stories to impart and archive, and reading your book was a breath of fresh air, reminding me that I wasn't alone, and that feeling torn between various cultural identities, speaking various languages and what those were, was part of my story, and that was okay. Not to mention the work that I do is worthwhile, and your book really helped me with that. So thank you so much for that.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
And it's funny because when I encounter reviews of My Broken Language or even talk to people who have read it, the resounding sentiment is just this, and how you unlocked or even deepened other Latinas' understanding of their own in-betweenness, the ni de aquí ni de allá of it all, and the journey of the lives that they live in that space. And so I was at the One Book opening night, and at that opening night event, a woman in the audience posed a question, and I'm paraphrasing towards the end of her question, but it was, how do I know I am Latina enough? Am I Latina enough? Am I Puerto Rican enough? Am I Venezuelan enough? Am I American enough? And you talked very specifically about how, and again, I'm paraphrasing, how we are enough and that we must cultivate, and that's what we must cultivate, and no one can check our boxes. How did you get there, girl? Because I struggle with that, and sometimes I feel really confident, and other times I'm not. And so is there one defining moment or even a set of defining moments that led you to that mindset?
The work and the struggle is ours to embrace or ignore. So let me share a little bit with how I got there. It's really two parts. It's gifts I was given through the blessings I was born into, and it's work I did. So let me talk first about the gifts I was given. Really, two things come to mind. One is a deeply entrenched and embodied lived philosophy of cariño, which is simply tenderness, or what felt arriving to me as a baby and all through my life as unconditional love. This cariño came from the female elders in my family. And those elders, some of them were, I remember my abuela was always ancient, as far as I remember. Like, she never aged, she just started ancient and stayed ancient until she passed on. Her approach to problem solving, to medicine, to spiritual counsel was cariño. And when you're constantly bombarded with unconditional love and tenderness, it feels very natural and given that you belong in the world. And that her philosophy of cariño infiltrated down through the generations. So my mother and her sisters also presented me with this approach to cariño. And I wasn't alone. This was the family approach. My older cousins approached me with cariño. There's a chapter in the book where I talk about my first menses. I was 10 years old and I became a woman, quite to my surprise. And the approach was one of supreme tenderness from my cousins. So I always had a sense of belonging, because when you're raised with when your garden is tended with such care, it is only natural to feel that you're belonging. The other gift that I was given that was part of this was the indigenous science wisdom that was passed from my grandfather, who I never met, to my mother, then to me. And that indigenous science teachings, those started on their plot of land in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, where he was a farmer. And so he used both his intuition and his experience and his learned teachings to cultivate the land. My mother came when she was 12 or 11 to Philly, and there was less land to cultivate. My interpretation of our family history is that after that migration, our actual physical bodies became our plots of land to farm. And the notion that plants belong, we are part of this world. Again, I was raised with a sense of belonging. There's no sense of me not belonging in the universe. So I was very blessed to receive those gifts, and I proselytized to all of the mentors and elders and teachers and matriarchs, as part of this circle today, that these are valuable teachings to give. They last a lifetime for our young people. Then there was work, because can you hear me, Jade? I have a little bit of fuzzy sound. Okay.
Oh yeah, no, I hear you fine.
Okay, great. So the work, I always felt when I was the first in my family to go to college, or when I, arrived as a Broadway playwright, like I had no plan of this. I didn't know Broadway from anything, okay? But I always had no question. Oh, I belong. If I belong on planet Earth, of course I belong in this room on planet Earth. The challenge and the difficulty for me was not, did I belong? It was, what do I do when the room I'm in is telling me that I don't belong, even though I know I do? And in my particular family, which is very diverse, has very different skin tones, I'm half white, so I present lighter than all of my family. What do I do when that particular room is telling me I belong, but my beloved mother doesn't? What do I do about that? And what I had to do was do a lot of work. After, I proceeded forth with a lot of confidence as a writer and as a young person, a lot of optimism, remembering my teachings and trying to hold them like the center. I was working in a theater industry where that was historically elitist and male and white. And though most of what I received was love and support, it became hard to ignore certain microaggressions over time, and they did take a toll. So I had to take a break, and for about 2 years, just work really hard to ask myself, what am I doing here? What is my strategy? What is my path? I had to recenter myself. So it's a process, the path of becoming that's a process.
And I appreciate so many of the things you said, and I definitely want to return to the subject of maternity and that passing on from the different women in your family. But something right now that struck me is that feeling that we are locked out of spaces, and that we've been having to create permanent spaces for ourselves, or kind of insert ourselves in specific spaces, and feeling validity in that. And that was one of the primary reasons I even started a platform like this, because I wanted to have these conversations, not only because I'm a dork, but also because I needed to feel like other people were having it as well, And so I think that to your point, that's so important. And so I hear you on what you did. And now I'm wondering, what could the everyday person that potentially is not necessarily in that situation, or perhaps is, how can they fuel and honor our multilingual, multicultural Blacks, as you put in your book, in order to keep them thriving in archives? Because we're doing the work that we can, that's safe for us, that makes us feel as okay as we can be, and that's not always going to work out. But what can others do to help us thrive and keep us archived as well?
I love the question, and for me, it's my life's work, and it's one of real joy. It's such joyous work, and two things come to mind. One is that, I think when you get into a practice of saying no to things, it can feel quite negative. And artists frequently get asked, will you do this project? Will you do that project? A lot of things come our way if we are blessed, and we have to get into a practice of saying no, or else we will, be unhealthy. But always remembering what we're saying yes to. When you're saying no to something, you're saying yes to something else, and being very clear and intentional about in your heart about what you're saying yes to. So another way to put that would be talking about resistance work. Our community, I think of North Philly, I think of El Barrio, and we are not alone. There are so many communities like ours with their own trajectories and troubles and triumphs in Philadelphia. These communities have evolved and have protected their genius through resistance work. However, resistance work alone is too negative and reactive, right? So resistance work has to be balanced by creative work, which is asserting who you, not just resisting what is incorrect, but also asserting what is correct and what one's truth is. And there you can find balance and harmony, and you can progress in a world. If the work is only resistance and only saying no, you're actually not paving a path for others to follow about what that world can be. The other thing, on a really pragmatic level, if you're talking about how do we do the work of cultural preservation, of advancing, creating what I like to think of as our library, this is the nuts and bolts of what I do. You literally ask someone a question. What year did you guys move to Philly? Wait, where was grandma from? And why did she stay when everyone else left? And you then, this is the key. This is the key. And this is one of the blessings and most fun things about life that we have. Then you listen. That's it. You listen. I have found in my practice that simply asking a question and then really being in a deep place of listening, it opens incredible gateways to my cultural and personal history that I would not have known if it had just been small talk, if I hadn't bothered asking. You can get into a practice of asking with a pen and paper in your hand so you can take some notes. Then the benefit of that is, I've never been good at keeping a diary, but I keep diaries of my conversations, of our family history. I can look back 25 years ago and remember what Theo said, what Thea said about years before I was born. So I hold that, I hold the family archive. And the truth is, our young people in our communities, they need our history. They deserve our history, and it will help them. So, we're just the next stepping stone on that path.
Yeah, and I appreciate that so much, because as a self-proclaimed 1.5 generation Latina myself, I consider myself fortunate to have had such strong ties to my Latinidad, to have stories, to have my notes on my Mac has like a bunch of my grandmother's quotes that are both absurd, but also there's wisdom there. It's a lot of absurdity too, but there's a lot of wisdom. And, I had those strong ties because of my grandma, because of my mom, my aunt, my extended family. In this case, my Cuban side, I'm Puerto Rican and Cuban. But I often worry, and that's what made me think of this. I often worry about how to pass our culture on to my future kids, how to ingrain in them what I was fortunate enough to see and learn, even though I wasn't born in those places, right? Like I always say, I'm like, we're not a new breed, we're just a different breed, right? But each generation gets that much further away, and I don't want to be morbid, but I keep thinking about, they're going to be gone. My kids aren't going to get to know Tio Tong and Tio Miguel and Mami. Like, they're not going to get to know those people like I did. And I have like this crazy privilege, right? Like, how do I get them that? How do I do that? And so that being said, what are some rituals perhaps you share with your kids that keep them rooted in their culture? Do they have access to those diaries? You said you're the keeper of those stories. Do they have access to that? Are they curious? Are they maybe not quite yet? What would you advise in that case?
Yeah, they have access. I will share stories with them that are age appropriate. But part of what I do is, the truth is that my mother, for instance, has knowledge and gifts that I simply do not have. So I can't quite serve as a proxy. I can pass down stories, I can pass down information, but I really am intentional and careful to create time when my mom is with the kids, because she does it better than me. She is herself better than me. When Titi Jenny was alive, I made sure that my daughter was in those rooms with Titi Jenny. So I kind of go out of my way to bring the generations together. And yes, we do. This is part of why we do the archive work. I do want to think about the notion of, as generations pass, we get farther and farther away. Because when you really zoom out and look at the history of the Caribbean, you know, what is it that we're getting farther away from? Really, when I think about Puerto Rico, what I see is an island that has been in that's one consistent truth for the last 600 years is development, progress, and change and evolution. So what are we getting farther from? Are we getting farther from our truth, or we're getting farther from that point on our timeline, but also getting closer towards our current truth? I think we have to use the lessons of the past and make our current truth deep and meaningful too. Our current lives here, for me, I'm in New York right now. I'm not even in Philly, which is the city. People think I live in Philly because I talk about it so much. But it's not that this life has less meaning and that the previous generations' lives had more meaning. It's that we take those lessons from history and we locate them in the now so that our current lives also have meaning. You know, I think, for instance, maybe parents out there right now are dealing with, how do we talk to our children? There was so much tragedy this week with the shootings in Buffalo. And these are times when, unfortunately, we would rather not be called to grieve our neighbors. We would rather not be called to have another talk with our children about this civil rights activism and movement that we all inherit as members of this nation. But, you know, coming to Philadelphia, coming to New York, those become our histories too. So we carry more histories now, and they're different ones than our brothers and sisters on the island. It doesn't mean they're farther from or less than, it means that they're evolving in new directions.
I appreciate that reframing. So thank you on a personal level. And I hope that anybody else that feels that can resonate with that response, because I've sometimes thought, well, I'm something different. I have these experiences that eventually my great grandkids will hear about, right? And they'll be like, oh, you know, crazy abuela, you know, Jay was doing this and that. And I like to think of that. But yeah, I guess when you're in the moment, it doesn't feel quite as worthy as our folks that we love and care so much. But I suppose we're gonna mean that to somebody else in the future. And that's what
and if I can tag one more thought onto that, I think the ni de aquí, ni de allá component, I always get a little nervous and careful about rigid notions of purity, pure identity in this nation, because it's hard for me to separate. We want to be authentic. What does authenticity mean? One artist I worked with said authenticity is an action. I think about that a lot. Authenticity is an action, okay. I think of authenticity as a complication personally, because when I try to get down to it, what is authenticity to me? Well, I'm mixed race, mixed culture, mixed religion home. So for me, my authentic truth is to really name and live in the places where those things harmonize and where they bump up against each other and don't. But whatever authenticity means for someone, I think purity is something to be very careful about. Well, who's the most Latino? Who's the most this, that, or the other? Because this nation has a really dangerous history with notions of racial purity. And I feel very reticent to get involved in playing that game because I think it can be to destructive end.
Yeah, sorry, were you finished with your thought there?
Yes.
Okay. I appreciate that as well, because society often forces us, I feel like, because of these reasons, this notion of purity, it forces mixed race and Latina folks to choose which side of their identities they represent. And so you just mentioned all of the beautiful things that make you who you are, right? And I feel that society makes it just so difficult to just be who it is that you are. And then this gets compounded, just to transition a little bit over to the language component. This gets compounded, but when someone of Latina descent doesn't speak Spanish or speaks it imperfectly or even uses Spanglish. So this notion of purity even carries into, unfortunately, our community's language, and people feel such shame, consistently such shame, because they don't do or speak the way that, and for anybody that's not watching, I'm big quotation marks here, they're not doing it right. They're not doing it. and that Spanglish is not valid, and it means that you're confused. And I have a lot of dorky things that I'm not going to say about that. That actually is not true. It's actually a sign of intelligence, but you in particular were told to write in your broken Spanish. And I feel that it's so important for other Latinas to hear, and other people that were potentially between two worlds and part of multiple worlds. How can Latinas who experience this, right? This idea that, oh, my Spanish is X, whatever X is, and I'm not enough, again, big quotation marks there. How can they find inspiration in their broken language, whatever that might be? Because it might not even be Spanish, I would like to say. It might be an Afro-based language, it might be an indigenous language. How can they find inspiration in that, particularly for those who are just coming into these conversations and realizations within their own Latinidad?
I mean, yes, I had a teacher say to me, she said, oh, are you going to write some plays in Spanish when you come to my workshop too? And I was like, yeah, well, you know, I throw in a little, as is my comfort level, but my Spanish is, you know, really, it's really broken. It's not at a level that I would write a full script in it. She was like, come write your broken language. And she just had the distance from the community, you know, and what a gift to say that. And so I like to think of a few things with this. One, I like to think of the compassion I hold for my family members that struggle in English. I hold compassion for them as they, you know, form their sentences with creativity, with beauty, when they're at a loss for words. So why would I not hold that same compassion for myself as I also try to fumble towards expression? I also think of Shakespeare. You know, this notion of language purity, I remember when I was a teenager, so the book talks about my coming of age in the 80s and 90s, and Ebonics was the whole big thing. And it was so controversial when I was a kid. And Ebonics was gonna like destroy the English language. It's, you know, and it's like, the English language is never complete. The English language evolves every day, and it evolves through change. So actually a real embracing of and gratitude for all of the Englishes out there. When I came to New York and I said I was from Philly, people would be like, oh, y'all say wooder? And I'm like, well, they say that in South Philly, but like, honestly, there's different English that I know from South Philly, West Philly, North Philly, like even within Philly, there's many different Englishes. I think of Shakespeare, you know, right? He's the scion of, you know, the height of the English language. He made up 1,000 words. Literally, the English dictionary grew by 1,000 words because he made stuff up and put them in his plays. Okay, now he literally broke the English language, and look where that got us. Now, looking at our history, which I really enjoyed writing a chapter in the book about our language history, I said, let me really position myself within the history of language on Boriquen. And really in the late 1400s, when Spaniards arrived, you know, that was the first colonial language brought to the island in recorded history. Before that, there were a number of native dialects, a very diverse and robust amount of native dialects. Those got kind of smushed together over the years after Spaniards came. And Spanish also imported some of those Arawakan and Taino dialects, right? We have words like hammock because the Tainos said hamaca for fishnet, right? So what's the pure language here? Also, we no longer have all of the words for what those dialects were or what all of the tribes and groupings were. Those got kind of conglomerated into larger groups, but there were smaller groups. Then what happens after smallpox, after rebellions from the natives? Well, Yoruba land, Nigeria, West Africans get imported, and they bring a tremendously rich linguistic history to the island. So we have more language. I didn't know, I learned when writing the book, the word merengue.
Yes, I've heard
Is a Yoruba word. Okay, the etymology is West African there. And look, now it's merengue. Now it's a Juan Luis Guerra mixed that we dance to, right? So, you know, what does God mean? I talk about that in the book. What does the word God mean? Well, in my family, it could mean many things. It could mean West African Orisha. It could mean Atabe. It could mean Jesucristo. So I try to put myself in the context of a broader linguistic becoming that is Boricua life, that is Latinidad. And I'm part of it and I can't change that. So I try to study it and embrace it and learn from and grow with it and have fun too, play with it.
And it's so funny because when you said about the creativity that our families use with English and other folks that are learning English as a second language, the first instance I said popped into my head and I had to keep myself from laughing was I had a friend who grew up in the neighborhood with me. I'm from Hudson County in Jersey. And once he was trying to tell me not to walk around his house without shoes on, but he told me not to walk around the house foot naked. And that's
I love it.
Right?
I love it. This is the thing. I mean, if you grew up in a multilingual household, you are witness to wonderful linguistic creativity. And one of the things, I mean, there was always this like, this story in my family because my dad was from Long Island. He's Jewish. My mom is Puerto Rican. English, Spanish is her first language. So there was always this story in my family that like my affinity with words came from my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized while writing the book, I'm like, oh my God, the creative, like my English comes from my mother, even though it's her second language, my love for the language, my wanting to like mess up the language and all that stuff, that comes from her. Like she gave me English, you know,
appreciation of it. Yeah,
absolutely. So foot naked. I love it.
It's one of my favorite stories because I was just like, this is great. And he was embarrassed. And I was like, no, this is brilliant. We're wrong.
Yes.
It was amazing. And so, you know, I appreciate everything you said about languages. And I really hope that people are listening. And I know that I've taken so much out of that. And so now, how do these languages continue to evolve in you? You know, in your book, you address so much about spirituality, maternidad, culture, just music, dancing, all those languages that you talk about. What's the next iteration of your broken language?
Well, can I talk about one of my favorite writing experiences of my life, which was writing the last chapter?
Absolutely.
The beginning of the last chapter, I kind of was like, I'm just gonna write what I've always wanted to write, which is describe. I'm embarrassed to say it, but I tell you, I had a great time writing it, which is describe the bodies of the women in my family. Because you grow up, you know, I grew up seeing the cover of Vogue when you're waiting with your shopping cart at the supermarket cash register and all the magazines are there, right? So you get inculcated with what beauty looks like and then what like neutral womanhood looks like, right? MTV, music stars, you know, I feel like the only kind of mass media counterbalance I had to this notion of skinniness, youth, and beauty was essentially Oprah Winfrey. You know, it was kind of like seismic when she rolled out the wagon with like 60 pounds of fat in the plastic bag. So she was starting to, even though she was buying into a notion of dieting and weight loss, and I don't begrudge her that at all, that is absolutely her right. She was also at the same time questioning the invisibility of, you know, bodies that didn't fit that kind of cover girl mold. You know, but I grew up, first of all, it was like Philly was always hot in the summer. We didn't have AC. Abuela's room had AC in the bed, house had AC in the bedroom, but like we don't hang out there. Right. So we're always sweltering. Like people are always like unbuttoning their jeans and like taking a shower to cool off and then like walking naked down the hall to go get dressed. And like, I just saw a lot of women's bodies. I didn't realize that fatness was something to be ashamed of. I didn't realize, like, I saw the magazine covers a little too old. So they didn't quite work on me. I already had access to this queendom of these big bodies, these big bellies, these kind of flat gravity affected boobs, like, and they were wonderful to me. They're beautiful. Like the female body was beautiful in my family. Scars, tattoos. Look, I don't know who's logged on to this, but I even like, it's like pubic hair, right? Like no one has pubic hair anymore, right? Everyone's like born bald or whatever. But it's like, I saw the bodies and I loved it as a kid. And I was like, I'm going to write them. I'm just going to describe them. And the question was about how is my language evolving? And I think about it because it remains one of my favorite chapters I've ever written, because I love that. And I didn't see that modeled in culture when I grew up, but I did see it modeled in the homes when I grew up. And now 2 years into a pandemic, I'm 44, like I see my body changing shape. I see my body starting to tell stories that are different than 4 years ago, than 10 years ago. I feel the little aches and pains. I get the kidney stones, blah, blah, blah. But I also see, I'm like, I remember when that was smooth. Now I've got the bumpy, So am I going to practice what I preach? And am I going to shout out that bumpy butt in the mirror? Or am I going to be like, oh, no, I don't like how my body's changing. And I'm happy to report that the way that my body language is evolving is fun. It feels like an adventure. And I think about Maya Angelou, who I think in her 70th year did an interview where she was saying, the breasts are interesting, their relationship with gravity. And she had a good sense of humor about it. So I feel like in terms of my evolving language, my evolving body language, I have things to look forward to.
That's amazing. And that's very inspiring. No, it is, because you're right. Your body changes and you look at things and when people, I get so frustrated when people are like, oh, well, I don't look like I did when I was 20. And I'm like, well, that would be weird, wouldn't it? If you're like 50 or 40 or like, I'm not 20, right? So why would I look like I was, when I was 20? That would be a little bit strange. So I appreciate that, because I think that I'm starting to see more dialogue like this in the media realm, people being proud, or people kind of being like, yep, that's what it is. And there's such power in that. And I appreciate considering that part of one of your languages and how you kind of are able to tell a story, and your body is part of that story.